Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt, and I'm glad to welcome you back to the Center for Security Policy for our webinar series. Remember, we do this every Wednesday at 1 p.m. To check the specifics of upcoming topics and speakers, please go to securefreedom.org under the webinar tab. I'll also give you a preview of upcoming events at the end of today's broadcast. Today's program is entitled Taiwan at a Crossroads, Growing Military and Ideological Threats, featuring our special guests, Grant Nugent and Stephen Bryant. Before proper introductions, let me just remind you that you are in listen-only mode. You can submit your text questions in the Q&A box on the GoToWebinar panel. I'll read as many questions as possible at the end of the program. This event is being recorded. It'll be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, and on our website at securefreedom.org. I'm excited to announce that over the past month, the Center has been ramping up a new China program, and I'm honored that our president, Fred Fleitz, tapped me to build it. This program features articles and papers by subject matter experts, and from now on, we'll also have this monthly webinar with a China focus. Our panelists today are the authors of the first two major papers produced under this new project, each taking a look at Taiwan's strategic situation from a different angle, and both are CSP senior fellows. Grant Nugent is a research fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, focusing on Asia-Pacific defense, political, and economic matters. Nugent is a retired U.S. Marine colonel and was the first U.S. Marine liaison officer to the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force. He also served as Reserve Head of Intelligence for Marine Forces Pacific and was the U.S. Marine Attaché, U.S. Embassy Tokyo on 2 occasions. Mr. Nugent has worked with the Taiwan Marine Corps over the years and has spent 2019 in Taiwan on a Ministry of Foreign Affairs fellowship, researching Taiwan's defense and how to improve it. And he's joining us this afternoon from tomorrow morning in Japan, so we have to give him a big thanks for joining us and giving us his time today. Welcome. Stephen Bryant is a leading expert in security strategy and technology. He's held senior positions in the Department of Defense, on Capitol Hill, and as the president of a large multinational defense and technology company. Dr. Bryant has 50 years of experience in government and industry. He has served as a senior staff director of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Trade Security Policy, and as a commissioner for the U.S.-China Security Review Commission. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
So, Stephen Bryant, the People's Republic of China says that Taiwan is a part of China, and openly says that it wants it back. You note that within days of Biden taking office, the Chinese sent more than a dozen warplanes, including nuclear-capable bombers, to penetrate Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Please walk us through how China might achieve a kinetic military conquest of Taiwan, what the response of Taiwan, the U.S., and regional powers might be, and why you recommend a joint military command to successfully counter this threat.
Well, that's a lot of mouthfuls, so I'll try my best to respond. The first thing is that China has made clear that if Taiwan declares its independence, whatever that exactly means, China will attack. They make no bones about it. They repeat it all the time, and it's very clear that that's their policy. It's also very clear that their policy is largely aimed at, militarily anyway, is largely aimed at taking back Taiwan. Now, the question is how they would do that. And that is a bit of guesswork because, their secret military plans are not something that normally is made available to us so we can judge whether it would work or not. But they have some options. I mean, one option is to simply bombard Taiwan with missiles. They have lots of missiles. And there's not a whole lot Taiwan can do about it. In an attempt to try and create enough furor inside of Taiwan, destabilize Taiwan, and force the Taiwanese government, such as it is, to sue for peace with China. That's one option. That one's they practiced many times before. Back in '96, they organized a very big missile operation, and there was a lot of fear that what they were practicing they were then going to actually carry out. That's why finally President Clinton sent 2 carrier task forces into the Taiwan Straits, in the area of the Taiwan Straits, to send a message to the Chinese that we were going to defend Taiwan. that's the great question, of course. Now, China has other options to destabilize Taiwan. Back in 1947, not long after the remnants of the Kuomintang forces escaped to, or were in the process of escaping to Taiwan from China, Mao decided to attack one of the islands that was controlled by the Kuomintang forces. That was the island of Quemoy, also known as Kinmen. Actually, the real name is Kinmen. The Portuguese name is Quemoy. And the idea, and they did it. They sent about 9,000 troops across the water. It's very close to Kinmen is very close to the border of China. And the idea was they would quickly take over Kinmen, force concessions from Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, and basically take it back. The problem is they lost the war. They invaded in 1947 with these troops, but they were beat in 3 days of fighting by the Taiwanese military forces. So that's another option. There's also the island of Penghu, where Taiwan has an airbase, an important airbase that's close to China, which they could also attack. So they have multiple options, and of course they could attack today from the sea because the Chinese Navy is now stronger than it was in years past. They've really built up their Navy and their Air Force, and then of course they could use their Air Force, but they would then face a very strong Taiwanese Air Force, I think very strong, and certainly capable of defending the island, at least for a short time. So those are some of the options. The real problem is that Taiwan, is a peanut compared to China. I mean, Taiwan's an island of 26 million people, more or less, and China is a country of 1 billion plus. So the imbalance is huge. And what happens to Taiwan is going to, and Graham will talk more about this, I'm sure. Graham will talk more about it. Is going to influence what happens to Japan in terms of its security and its relationships to China, what happens to the US, what happens to Okinawa. All these things are in the blend. My feeling is that it's foolish to think two things. One, that Taiwan could defend itself by itself. I think that's probably not possible, at least not for very long. And the second, which goes with the first, is that if Taiwan and its friends, maybe the Japanese, maybe the United States, want to help without having some means of helping, some way of coordinating, they won't be able to do very much. So what I have proposed, and that's not an original idea of my own, it was given to me not by Taiwanese people, but actually from retired military leaders in Japan, was that we need a coordinated military command of the United States, Japan, and Taiwan to deal with this kind of threat profile. And the advantages of that, and I've written about this, the advantages is that once you can coordinate and you have the same communications, the same IFF systems on your aircraft, once you can do that, you essentially triple the kind of force that you can put in front of the Chinese. And you not only triple it, but you force multiply it, because we have, and the Japanese now have, the F-35 fighter, which is a very good fighter, and we have strategic bombers. So when you add all that into the equation, it becomes too formidable for China to take the chance. China is strategizing, would they be able to attack without the US coming in to save Taiwan? Will the US politically allow it to happen? And then even if the US doesn't allow it to happen, if we go in without being prepared and without being coordinated, it's really not a very good situation. We could lose. The simulations that have been tried out by the Marines, by the RAND Corporation and others, keep showing us losing to the Chinese. And I think one of the reasons behind that is that we're not talking about a coordinated response. So I propose a joint military command. It doesn't have to be public, but it has to exist, where all these things are coordinated and made to work together so that if the worst case comes, we'll be ready.
Steve, maybe just a minute follow-up. What's the support of the current political leadership in the U.S., Japan, and Taiwan for actually creating that?
Well, I think that the U.S. the jury is out. We don't know. Now, this never was part of U.S. planning. I mean, be fair about it. The Pentagon never planned for that. In fact, the relationship between the Pentagon and Taiwan stinks. I mean, it's limited. It's very narrow, and there's no joint system about anything. There is some secret cooperation with radars and stuff, but that's not enough. So we don't know. The State Department is probably against it. They always are against it. It'll disturb the Chinese. They won't be able to eat their rice. So there's always that problem. Japan will do what the United States does. I mean, they'll follow us because first of all, we're tied to them by a mutual defense treaty. But even more than that, they're looking for clues about what the United States is going to do. Because if the United States isn't going to help out, Japan is going to hide and not help out. So I think, those are, that's the reality. It doesn't mean you can't do it. Near the end of the Trump administration, there was some significant improvement in military to military relations and some diplomatic improvement. Now, where that is now, I have no idea, but I don't, I really can't answer where we're going. And that the Pentagon has, Mr. Biden has launched a study that's being done by the Pentagon, which essentially is going to evaluate Taiwan's defense, which is good. I mean, I think it's good. But of course, it depends on what they come up with. If they come up with, well, maybe they need more of this or a little more of that, the Council on Foreign Relations to say, well, we need to improve Taiwan's defense. But they're not saying anything about the U.S. role other than that. The Taiwan, basically the Congress provided through the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 that the U.S. would provide military equipment to Taiwan for its defense. But the U.S. really shortchanged the Taiwanese for more than 30 years and didn't give them what they really needed. And even now, today, even if we gave them everything they could possibly desire, it's not enough. You can't defend one single place. You need to be able to bring forces in from outside to make a really tough military problem for the Chinese. And I think that that is what we're missing.
Thank you. So Grant, while Steve's paper focused primarily on the before and during phases, as we call them, of an attack on Taiwan, you focused on the after phase. So you look at the disturbing prospects of a Chinese victory and the rapid change in Asia-Pacific political alignments that it might precipitate. Could you please walk us through the reasons that the U.S. should defend Taiwan in the first place, and why, on the other side, the PRC needs to take Taiwan, especially within the concept of reaching the first island chain?
Okay, well, thanks very much, Adam. First, how was my voice? I always feel like I need to talk to cover 5,000 miles. Can you all hear me?
It's fine, Grant. Yep.
Okay, good. The first thing I'd like to talk about is why China would think it is worth taking Taiwan and even fighting for it. A long time ago, you would go, and even now, you go into the Japanese military headquarters in Tokyo, and there's a map on the wall in many of the offices. And what it is it's a map of the Western Pacific, but is oriented looking from mainland China. So it's as if you're 10 miles up in China looking eastwards, and what you see is a chain of islands stretching from Japan through southwards, through Taiwan, through the Philippines, down to Indonesia and Malaysia. And that's the so-called first island chain. And that map told me, and more than anything that I've ever read, about how China looks at things. their defense position. And you see Taiwan in the middle of this island chain. It's got what real estate agents call location, location, location. You're smack in the middle of America and its friends' first defense line. And that's what Taiwan gives you if you take it. So by taking Taiwan, either by force or by just browbeating it into submission, China has suddenly breached the defenses that have been bottling them in, and it has pretty much free access into the Western Pacific. And if you look at it and say in old castle fighting terms, you breach the castle wall. And that gives you a huge advantage. Additionally, if you look the other direction, Taiwan, when it's not under Chinese control, it potentially can serve as a base for attack on China and an intelligence collection platform. So seize Taiwan and you've eliminated that threat as well. Additionally, and it always helps if you have a map at hand when you're considering these issues. If China takes Taiwan and it suddenly has leverage over every other regional nation, particularly Japan, its big enemy. And what it's done is you're in a position to cut the sea lanes through the South China Sea, through which much of Japan's trade goes and most of its energy flows. So you're in that position to interdict. And South Korea is in an even worse position, even more isolated. So that's another benefit for taking Taiwan. But couldn't the ships just travel around to the east, take a detour? Yes, they can. But with the Taiwan military operating off, the Chinese military operating off of Taiwan, their range, their reach into the Western Pacific is extended. So they will just extend their operations farther out and take care of any detours that anyone's trying. Now, I've mentioned the South China Sea, and take Taiwan, and China will have locked up the South China Sea pretty much. China's always said that the South China Sea belongs to China, even though there's not a shred of evidence in international law for that. And one has to admit that by about 2014-15, China had de facto control of the South China Sea. They've been harassing regional nations that have claims in the area, but take Taiwan, and China is then in a position to make sure that any other country in the region or elsewhere only uses the South China Sea at the PRC's sufferance. But I mentioned Japan, and that's I think deserves some particular attention, is that because to Japan, Taiwan is immensely important. Once again, look at the map. Japan has recognized the threat, and it has been defending or fortifying, sort of, its southern islands, the Ryukyus or the Nansei Choto. But lose Taiwan, and Japan's southern defenses are outflanked. They can be rolled up from the south. And also, you're going to find that the Japanese will have to suddenly start defending their eastern approaches to the ocean out to the east of Japan once Chinese submarines, ships, and aircraft start operating there more regularly, which is what Taiwan allows you to do. This is obviously going to put a crimp in operations of US forces in the region as well. So that gives you some idea of what the reasons why it is military advantageous for the PRC to take Taiwan. But also, it's not just looking up at Japan, looking eastwards, but also take Taiwan, and that serves as really the base of what is a potential Chinese salient into down to the southwest, southeast, and it's in the heart of U.S. defenses in the Central Pacific. And that's once again, that is no small accomplishment for the Chinese. A fellow named Paul Giara years ago came up with some idea and a map, something called the China Salient. And what it is effectively, if you look at it, it's like a big arrow with Taiwan at its base, Sakhalin Island up at the north, as the northern end, and Singapore down at the south, and Guam as sort of the point of the arrow. And that gives you an idea of how the Chinese would conceptualize it and how they would go about exerting influence and military power right into the Central Pacific, down into the South Pacific, and also into the just directly south. They don't have any bases there yet, of course, but they've been laying the groundwork, and this is something that's gotten attention in recent years, is that the Chinese political warfare in the Central Pacific, the South Pacific, Southwest Pacific has been going on for 30 years. This is economic and commercial involvement, a physical presence, and this so-called elite capture, where bribes and presence helps grease the sort of grease things for the Chinese. They are aware, and this is everywhere. It goes from Okinawa, Palau, Yap, Saipan, Fiji, Tonga, Solomon Islands. Everywhere you look, there has been this Chinese political warfare going on, and with the potential for taking, at some point, getting military access. The Australians can read the map as well as anyone, and they see what's going on. And if you have a Chinese military presence, which the sort of the bump that you get from taking Taiwan and the operational advantages, which gives you that a Chinese military presence in any of those places that I named, suddenly Australia starts to feel threatened, potentially isolated. The Japanese understood this in 1941, but couldn't do anything about it. The Chinese always figured that they can do everything better than the Japanese can. And they take their time, but they have thought about the idea of bases in Central and Southwest Pacific. And that's part of the equation. It'll take some time, but believe me, they've thought about it. And so Taiwan gives you the foot in the door. And keep in mind as well that with Taiwan gone and the Chinese operating from there and using their political warfare, their influence efforts to expand their military presence and operations, U.S. facilities in Guam, Saipan, and Central Western Pacific, these are threatened as well. One would also say that one thing leads to another in the event of a Taiwan scenario. And take Taiwan, and a few steps out, you will have the Chinese operating east of Hawaii off the west coast. They've been getting up the connections, the commercial in particular, political with South America, into the Caribbean. So those are some of the reasons why China just might think it's worth it. You know, getting Taiwan would not be easy, and it would provoke potentially a response from the Americans and some other people. But at the same time, if you look at the map, look at the military advantage, that's is a pretty good sort of motivation for the Chinese to do something. What I've talked about, of course, is theoretical. What could the Chinese actually do? Right now, they could do a lot. They've undergone the biggest, fastest military buildup probably in history, and their ability to project power within the first island chain that I've mentioned, that they can pretty much project lots of power. Whether they could take Taiwan by force is debatable. I think they could have a pretty good shot at it. But you've also got one thing to keep in mind as we talk about power projection, but China has the ability already to put men and equipment on ships and take it pretty much anywhere they want to go, and if they're not challenged. And this is in peacetime. And there's power projection. It can also mean influence projection. And China has the ability to do that already. Their amphibious forces have built up pretty well. And once again, and their capacity for joint operations, their long-range aerial operations, airborne operations, it gets better and better. There's a long way to go, but they do have a good capability already. And as I say, it keeps getting better. It's worth considering that in 2005, that the Chinese had nothing in Djibouti. And now, 14 years later, they've got an armored unit there and a base. So over time, you can see how this potentially could play out in the Pacific. Just one last thing, I would note the sheer numbers that China can deploy, numbers of ships in particular that China can deploy in the South China Sea far outnumbers what the U.S. can. It's said that for every ship that America can put into the South China Sea, the Chinese could deploy 10 ships if they had felt like it. So what we're seeing is if Taiwan falls, the entire dynamic in the Pacific, in Eastern Asia, I would say Western, all of Asia would change, where the PRC will have showed that it alone has the power and the will to dominate Asia. And every regional nation is going to notice this. So what I've laid out there is sort of why China would want to take the risk of seizing Taiwan. Now, later on, I can address what the actual outcome that would be politically within the region about that. So, thank you.
And I think you put a great geographical image in our mind as well, as far as the layout there. And yeah, we'll return to your case studies of a few of the countries that you looked at and go a little deeper in that. So Steve, to return to the US angle, you wrote a subsequent piece regarding a Pentagon-China task force consisting of 15 civilian and military Pentagon employees announced last week by the Biden administration. You see their task as, quote, engineering a US policy that recognizes that the area is a tinderbox that could erupt at any time and that Chinese ambitions may be out of control and difficult to tamp down, unquote. What do you think the Biden task force will accomplish, and what are your recommendations to them?
Well, first of all, that language was partly theirs, not mine. So it's important to understand that they're approaching it, at least at the start of this exercise, from maybe the right point of view. That doesn't mean they're going to come out with the right answers. You know what I mean? They're starting to look. There's a threat out there, guys. So we got to deal with it. That's it. Okay. That's good. The second good part is that this task force is supposed to be half Pentagon civilians and half Pentagon military from the Joint Staff and from the military departments. That offers some hope that we'll have something worthwhile at the end of the exercise. I don't have great expectations for this task force, because one of the other little items mentioned in setting up the task force is that, of course, it has to coordinate with the State Department and the other agencies. And as soon as you get that, it gets watered down, it gets neutralized, and I'm not sure it'll amount to a whole lot. It's not clear to me. I don't think they grasp, the administration grasps what's at stake exactly. And I would like to add something to what Grant was talking about, and he may want to cover it later himself. I mean, aside from the military and strategic parts of this equation, which are quite considerable, there is also the threat to liberal democracy in the Pacific. I mean, Taiwan especially is a hugely successful democracy. It's really, I was a presidential election observer in Taiwan, and I was able to go around and talk to all the candidates, both the local ones and the ones going to the legislative yuan and the presidential one, the whole 9 yards. And you get really quickly to understand that they like democracy. It's really important. People are behind it. It's quite critical. Liberal democracy is important to Japan. We may have brought it there, but they've embraced it. And I think embraced it the right way. It's important to many of the other countries in the Pacific region. And everyone's seen what's happened in Hong Kong. And it's not over in Hong Kong. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And we're not going to get better. So, I mean, I think that motivated the Taiwanese more than almost anything else when they saw that. That took away any argument from the pro-Chinese element, and there are some in Taiwan. It took away any argument because they don't like that. This is not acceptable in the Taiwan body politic, this kind of situation. Which tells me that if something happens and the island is crushed by China, that the fallout from that is going to reach right back to the United States, and we're going to be talking about who lost Taiwan, just as in the 50s we were talking about who lost China. And it's going to be tremendous fallout, tremendous fallout. We don't want to go there if possible. I mean, my idea is to try and organize strength, kind of joint command, make our strength possible so that the Chinese get it and they decide the time is not ripe to attack Taiwan, that they're going to lose. I think that's the message I'm trying to get across.
Let's say if you had the ability to have some sort of centralized, direction to this task, what would you do immediately to intervene from what's possible from the U.S.'s perspective right now to, let's say, an emergency defense of Taiwan or beefing up of Taiwan?
Well, I mean, look at the numbers. If you go through the numbers of aircraft that we could bring to bear, not the carriers are an important adjunct, but you don't need them. The aircraft we have in Japan, the aircraft we have in Okinawa, which is part of Japan, and then the bombers that we have in Guam, and can reinforce, because that's the I don't understand it, but the policy is to reinforce Guam, not to have them 100% present all the time. We can even bring aircraft from Alaska, from Washington State, from California. I mean, we have all these possibilities. The Japanese have a formidable, I think their Air Force is the most impressive thing the Japanese have. It's not battle tested, but we do exercise with it, and we have, presumably they know how to fight. I think that ability to bring those capabilities together, that's the strong point. We have some weak points. You want to know about the weak points? We have very poor air defenses. We have Patriot in Japan. We have Patriot in Taiwan. We have SM-3s on our ships, but they're far away from the war zone or potential war zone. So our air defenses are weak, but they're not only weak there, they're weak in Europe, they're weak in the Middle East, they're weak everywhere. Unfortunately, this is work that if I were on that task force, I say strengthen the damn air defenses all around, even in the United States. Give us some chance to defend ourselves. But because China has a lot of missiles. Forget about their Air Force. They got lots of missiles. You have to be able to knock off their missiles, or at least counter them some effective way, or they'll knock off your bases. So that's the strengthening of air defenses is extremely important. And the Pentagon's not doing it. They simply aren't. They have, a country like Israel does it because they know they have to absolutely do it or they're not going to survive. It's not quite that clear cut in the United States, but it's getting that way. So we should be working on air defenses as a national priority. That would greatly help our forces and our allied forces in the Pacific and everywhere else for that matter.
So to zoom out again, Grant, the second half of your paper is a systematic evaluation of the regional players in the strategic environment after a potential Taiwan conquest. And you rate each country on a scale of red, the countries that will come under the near total influence of Beijing, to blue, the countries that hold strong and perhaps consolidate their opposition, and various shades of pink in between. Can you share your analysis of the vital US allies, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, which each fall in a different place on your scale?
Sure, I'll be glad to. As you mentioned, what I tried to do was think through what would actually be the political, the psychological effect of Taiwan coming under Chinese domination. And it's worth always considering really the searing impression that would be made on regional nations if Taiwan falls. And what that lesson would be is that the United States and no combination of other countries could prevent China from taking Taiwan by force or just by bullying them. And that is a democratic, independent nation, Taiwan, and the US military couldn't stop it. The threat of US economic and financial sanctions couldn't stop it. American nuclear weapons couldn't stop it. And if the Americans couldn't, well, then who can? And that is, as I say, the message that is going to be delivered just throughout the region. So there's that old expression, Asia turned red. It goes back years. And so I sort of tried to think through this. And you think about it, and it's gonna, I'll start with the good news, Japan. I think Japan will probably stay blue and with us, but they are going to have some real doubts about US resolve, about US commitment and capability. This could be the thing, actually, it does take a shock, actually, to get Japan to do anything. And maybe this would be the shock. Hopefully they haven't lost their southern islands in the process of China taking Taiwan, and that is possible. But it takes a shock, and this might be it. It might be what it takes for Japan to improve its conventional capabilities. Currently, the Japanese military is not the sum of its parts, but maybe this would do it. You could expect Japan to produce nuclear weapons if this happens. I think such will be the doubt about the US commitment, although everyone will talk about how solid it is. But maybe this will be what it takes to get the Japanese and the Americans to finally set up a joint operational headquarters of their own, which doesn't exist after 60 years of a splendid alliance. Could Japan, and so in one sense, it's a good thing. Or I say that's the glass half full way of looking at it. But would Japan possibly cut a deal with the Chinese? I don't see that. They don't like each other, and Japan would not. They would do anything to avoid domination and certainly occupation by the Chinese. I just don't see that happening, even in peacetime, when people talk about great relations or improved relations between the two countries. I don't think that's possible at all. But South Korea, this is going to be a little different, I think. I would expect it to become some shade of pink if Taiwan falls. Why would that happen? How could it happen? Once the US and Japan really start to get closer, and once Japan makes nuclear weapons, and either of those is going to cause the South Koreans to become angry or irritated. And if you have in Korea, if you have a leftist administration like the current one, it would be glad to argue that the Americans are not reliable, they can't defend us, and they're in bed with the Japanese. And gladly, I think they would shift South Korea to the PRC, would start to stiff arm the Americans. If it was a conservative South Korean government in position, even they might find that they really felt they had no choice but to listen to what the PRC is saying, to get closer to them. And especially if the price of fending off China was for the South Koreans to join up with the Japanese and the Americans. Such is really the depth of animosity in Korea when it comes to things Japanese. And you could expect South Korea to build nuclear weapons of their own, which would not make the Japanese happy. So I see South Korea. I don't think our relationship with them would end, but I think it would not be the same. It would weaken. It would turn, I think, into some shade of pink. I wouldn't be surprised in all of this if North Korea launched a missile or two at Japan, probably with Chinese encouragement, really as a warning to nations about tying up with the Americans, but also as a way to distract the Americans from looking at the Taiwan issue. Now, Australia, that's a good, I think that's one, that's kind of optimistic. There are Australians, well, I think Australia will stay blue unless certain people get in power. There is a constituency in Australia which does very well financially with from the PRC, and they would be glad to kowtow. But I think in Australia, on both sides, the Conservatives and the Liberals, there does seem to be a sense that they're not going to back down. And you've seen that in the last 4 years, where the Australians have actually stood up to China. They're getting hammered now, but this just seems to encourage their resolve. So I think Australia would still be on our side, but they too, they really would have some doubts about the U.S. And if we couldn't keep Taiwan free, that the relationship won't be the same, but it'll still be there. So what I think we might be left with is the Americans trying to cobble together a defense with Japan in the north, working through the Central Pacific, where we through that defense line, where we have our own territories, but we also have nations that have compact of free associations with us. Palau has offered us a base recently. And then that chain works, so sort of the second island chain, it works down to Australia. But it'd be very difficult, I think, for us to have the support west of that. What I would see, Cambodia, the elite there has been red for a long time. The potential for a Chinese military base in Sihanouk exists today. That would not be good. I'd say Malaysia would be pink, Thailand pink, Vietnam pink, but there's only so much they don't like the Chinese, only so much they could do. Indonesia as well, I think it'd be different. I think they would come under Chinese pressure not to tie up with the Australians or to get too close with us. So you look west of that first island chain and everything looks pink, the Philippines as well. So it'd be much harder for us to operate as we've been doing should Taiwan fall. I think we'd find ourselves defending up more to the east. I haven't mentioned the Indian Ocean, but things don't look a whole lot brighter there. Myanmar as well, dark pink would be my way of looking at it. So Asia may not turn red, but a lot of it would turn pink.
Excellent. All right. Well, we have time here to go to questions.
Right before we go there, I think you have to keep in mind that there's a large constituency in the U.S. for China, and that most of that's in the high tech, but not only in the automotive, many other industries are tied into China and put pressure, and can put pressure on our government, especially this administration, which was backed by most of those industries. And so if you're doing politics, and I'm not doing politics, I'm a strategist, but if you're doing politics, that's a political development that really can strongly influence, if not decide, U.S. policy. But maybe we're pink too.
Right.
No, Wall Street's dark red. Okay.
Alrighty. So, how would Russia view a Taiwan takeover by China? Anyone? Grant, why don't you? Yeah,
well, I'll jump in. They wouldn't mind it, I think, in the sense that it causes America no end of trouble. It causes America's friends no end of trouble. But I think Mr. Putin, he must wake up every morning wondering if there's going to be 10 Shenzhens on his side of the border in Siberia. There's unfinished business in Eastern Russia from China's perspective. The Russians took their territory and they're going to get it back someday. Take Taiwan, and it beefs up China. It's psychologically, militarily, and it gives them even more reason to push. And the idea that that we're their only enemies is the wrong one. I think Russia knows that they're on the list as well. So I think that Russia might be immediately happy, but in the long term, I think they would might find that they don't like what happens afterwards.
All right, this one might be good for Steve. In a recent Council on Foreign Relations by Blackwell and Zelikow regarding PRC options for taking over Taiwan, one of the three options discussed a PRC quarantine, not a blockade, of Taiwan to prevent outsiders from providing defense supplies to Taiwan. What do you say about this option that is short of war and achieves their objective of moving in the direction that pressures Taiwan?
Well, first, I don't know how you do it. You mean a political quarantine, or do you mean an actual military quarantine? I don't think that's realistic. I mean, they always complain bitterly about our arms sales to Taiwan. I mean, that's SOP, standard operating procedure. Well, beyond complaining, I don't know what they really can do, and I don't think we'd pay any attention to it. I think it would be, that's not a realistic option.
All right. So let's turn back to Grant for the Indian Ocean, or rather, well, the Quad. Will the Quad be formalized? That's India, Australia, Japan, and the U.S., and work over time to deter communist China?
I think the Quad is it's a good thing. I think it is probably one of the best developments in Asia from our perspective in a long time. I could see the Quad as serving as really the basis of trying to recover from Taiwan getting taken over by China. I think all nations in it would have an interest in trying to hold the line. So I do see the Quad as having considerable potential, obviously militarily, but also politically and economically. There's a lot of possibilities. It's best to get started before the disaster strikes, but I do see that all four nations have an interest in one, keeping Taiwan free, but if something does happen, in certainly working together even harder. India, as we know, is under immense pressure from the Chinese. I don't know if immense is the right word, but it's so persistent, so thoroughgoing that it qualifies as immense, I think, and it's been going on for decades, and it's worsening in recent times. So the Quad is a very good structure, and the better you can work together to take on the PRC, the better. That's sort of a truism, and the Quad is a good way to do that.
There's a question here, but I just want to grab part of it, which is it's basically a question about spies on Taiwan. So maybe just some comments on spies or espionage on Taiwan from China.
They do it.
Whoever. All right.
That's just, I mean, it's a fact of life, isn't it? I mean, and it's very hard to ferret them out. And every now and then they arrest somebody for doing it. Then the Chinese arrest somebody in China who's Taiwanese for the same reason. So it goes on and on. I mean, I don't know. There's always been a question about how secure high-tech U.S. weapons would be in China, and it was used as an excuse not to provide the F-35 to Taiwan. I don't think it's an adequate or acceptable excuse. And in any case, the technology of the airplane is not what you're transferring. You're transferring the airplane. And the Chinese have plenty of opportunities to look at the F-35. They've stolen most of the plans for it from the United States already. Who knows what else they got about it. But in any case, I think that espionage certainly goes on, but I don't think it's very decisive.
I would suggest that it is a serious, I think it's a more serious consideration. I would note that, for example, over the years, it seems like regularly that senior Taiwan military officers, usually retired, but not always, are caught spying for China. And let's say that's just one example. I've even had Taiwanese in formal meetings say, can't you Americans help us with our espionage problem? Taiwan has not had a security clearance system of the sort we had, for example, or something that and particularly doesn't apply to retired officers. But this has been a huge problem. Part of the deal is that military pay is so low, pensions are so low, that the Chinese have a lot to work with. And that tracks back to the question of Taiwan's defense. We talk a lot about hardware and equipment and weapons, etc. Those are important, but the personnel gets overlooked, and that is a very serious state in Taiwan because they treat the troops like serfs. The pay is low. There's nothing like a GI Bill. The benefits are nothing to speak of, and it's not a respected profession. And if you've got a demoralized military, that you're going to have a hard time defending yourself. And that's something which you'd like to see somebody that gets some direct attention from the Taiwanese government, and with the US side encouraging and helping them to fix that. But if you don't get the people right, you've got a military like the US military in the early 1970s, not what you want. Japan faces a similar problem, by the way, that the terms of service are just so bad, and it's not a respected profession. But that's something that needs addressed, and I think that would, in some way, go to help with dealing with part of the espionage problem in Taiwan. But I wanted to make sure I got that point in because it doesn't get the attention.
But there are two different. You're talking about two different things in a way. You know, the high-ranking military guys who retire and get bought up by the Chinese. That's one side of the coin. And the other is the grunt, the average soldier who's not well taken care of in Taiwan. I agree with that. I think there are two different problems. One can be solved. The one of the soldier could be solved if we had better U.S. military to Taiwan military relations, because then we would have more influence and would be able to help them understand what they need to change, and also help their governments to make those decisions. The higher ranking is a bigger problem in a way because it's bribery. You know, it's you buying people. By the way, they do it here too, the Chinese, just to mention.
Yeah. I would note that
It's not restricted to Taiwan or Japan or anywhere else. It's all over the place.
We'll see them and raise them one. But you do find that Taiwan routinely loses good senior officers, say at the colonel level in particular, because they see no future, and as I say, the terms of service are not good. So that has hurt them a lot. As you said, you know, Steve, that we have ignored the Taiwanese for 40 years. We won't be seen in public with them. We will not do joint training with them, despite our professions of undying love. And until we start treating them like friends and allies, that it is really going to hamstring the defense of Taiwan. And I think if this hour showed anything, it's the absolute fundamental importance of that island and that free nation to our defenses, to the free world's defenses and civilized nations' defenses in the region. And I don't think that is hyperbole at all.
I agree.
Sort of a tech strategic question here. What would be the consequence of China taking over the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corp?
Big deal. It's Taiwan Semiconductor, Taiwan Semi, as it's known, is a very high-end producer, very critical to 5G, for example, where they're having a tremendous impact and making billions of dollars in the process. And they're building a new plant in Taiwan, a big expansion at the 3 nanometer feature size, which is about as small as you could possibly get in feature size, which is a cutting edge, absolutely cutting edge. They're also building a plant in the U.S., in Arizona. I think they're hedging a little bit, but it is clearly a strategic industry Taiwan has a number of very significant high-tech companies across the spectrum, everything from materials to electronics, which are very impressive.
And this will probably have to be our last one. Could you comment on Chinese collaboration with Myanmar to create another trade route in order to not be held bound by the Straits of Malacca?
That's a great.
Yeah, the Chinese can read the map as well as anyone, and they've had that in mind for a long time. Just it's been sort of fitful progress, partly because a lot of Burmese or Myanmarese don't like them. But at the regime level, they're as corrupt as they come, and it's probably pretty easy for China to subvert the ruling class. And this latest coup has given them China opportunities. There's of course claims the Chinese were involved. I would be inclined to put my money on that. But it gives that potential access to ports in Myanmar, access to the Bay of Bengal, onward into the Indian Ocean. It is a huge advantage. And part of the Chinese thinking for a long time has been to bypass the Straits of Malacca, avoid that sort of the potential for those straits being blocked and Chinese trade being blocked in the process. And if you can establish a sort of a route overland via Myanmar that's substantial enough, you can almost allow, or even do it via Malaysia, you can let Singapore die on the vine. And Singapore is sort of an irritant for the Chinese. But that is Chinese thinking as I understand it. But one thing to keep in mind is that if, as I said, Asia turns pink, and say Malaysia, say Singapore, find themselves with no choice but to acquiesce in Chinese demands or wishes, it is possible that maybe the Straits of Malacca could be closed to us. So it'd be hard to move naval forces around. The global reach we talk about may be threatened as well. So a lot of things could happen should Taiwan go, and none of them good.
All right, we'll have to close it out there. I think we covered a lot of ground here regarding Taiwan's strategic, military, geographic, economic, I know that I have a wider understanding, and I hope everyone else does too. I will just briefly go over our upcoming programs before we sign off. So next week, we have the future of the U.S. Navy in the Biden administration. That's the 24th, 1 p.m. Eastern, moderated by the Center's John Rosamondo and featuring Bryant Clark of the Hudson Institute and Brent Sadler of the Heritage Foundation. Followed by March 3rd, the growing politicization and weaponization of U.S. intelligence, moderated by the Center's Fred Fleitz and featuring Pete Hoekstra, who just came on as the Center's chairman of the Center's Policy Board of Advisors, former U.S. ambassador and representative, and Bill Gertz, national security correspondent from the Washington Times and prolific author on these subjects. So with that, one second. Okay, yes, with that, thank you to our guests, Stephen Bryan and Grant Newsham. Thanks to the audience for joining us at the Center for Security Policy. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll see you next Wednesday at 1 p.m. Thank you, folks.